All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Adam Ortega. I'm the communications coordinator for Alaska Community Action on Toxics. We're an environmental justice research nonprofit based out of Anchorage, Alaska. This is a webinar talk slash conversation with science journalist Matt Simon, author of A Poison Like No Other: How Microplastics Corrupted Our Planet and Our Bodies. If you want to get a copy of this bad boy, you can get 30% off using the link that I just dropped in that webinar chat. Use code webinar for 30% off. So before we get started, I do want to say that Alaska in the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, and climate change is only exacerbating the transport and mobilization of persistent organic pollutants. Unfortunately, they travel on ocean and wind currents, and they also bioaccumulate in subsistence foods in Alaska. This leads to indigenous people in Alaska having some of the highest levels of persistent pollutants of any pollution in the world because of their reliance on traditional foods. That's why we work to achieve a strong global treaty on plastics. It's actually under negotiation right now because of the disproportionate effects of plastics and chemicals on Alaska. We do this because we work with the International Pollutant Elimination Network and other movement partners to have a global treaty for plastics. And yeah, we know that it's nasty stuff. Like I said, this is a program of CHE Alaska, a program of ACAT, Alaska Community Action on Toxics. It's also part of a broader national coalition of over 5,000 individuals globally. So without further ado, I will introduce our very special guest today, science journalist Matt Simon, author of A Poison Like No Other. So let's just get right into it, Matt. Why'd you want to write a book about plastic?
Because I'm a glutton for punishment, apparently. So I got the idea in the midst of the pandemic, kind of toward the tail end, and I had been reporting here and there for Wired magazine on studies as they were trickling out. So microplastics being found in water, ice, air, those sorts of things, and nobody had done a kind of a cohesive popular science book specifically about microplastic. Lots of them about macroplastic, the big stuff, bottles and bags. That's obviously been an issue for decades. All along, we have had this invisible problem of microplastics. So what I try to do with the book is, while I was on lockdown during the pandemic and had lots of free time, I dove into the literature and kind of gathered up the current state of the science on microplastics, talked to a bunch of researchers, and kind of collated all that into kind of this insight, I hope, into what has not only been a major problem all along that we've been producing plastics, but is getting exponentially worse as the decades go on.
For sure. Well, let's just start at the beginning. At the beginning of the book, uh, you talk about how the first kind of plastics involved billiards and how they were made out of ivory. Now, there was a $10,000 cash prize to find an alternative, right? Can you talk a little bit about that and how we started living in this plastic fantasy?
Yeah, this is the ultimate tragedy of plastics is the origin. So this $10,000 prize, excuse me, so at the end of the 1800s was to find a suitable replacement for billiard balls made out of ivory. You are obviously running out of elephants that are being slaughtered for their tusks to turn into billiard balls. And this professional billiard player put out a $10,000 prize, said, please, somebody think up some sort of synthetic material to replace that. And they landed on the first mass producible plastic. Kind of a funny story within that is that this first kind of plastic was highly flammable and quite explosive. So it's the same stuff that they made early film out of, and that's why that stuff is flammable as well. And there were reports if you hit a billiard ball hard enough made out of this early plastic, it would explode. So not ideal. But this is what opened the floodgates, right? So we had this first mass producible synthetic polymer that people were making that turned into dozens upon dozens of different kinds of plastics that we now know today. Really, after World War II is when production started increasing exponentially. So it was, again, this tragedy that it was well intentioned, right? It was about saving elephants, but it doomed the planet to now drown in ever more plastics year after year.
Sure, sure. And fast forward, 100 so years, it's the mid-century. You talk about this plastic paradox, right? The fact that it's useful enough to use once and then we throw it away. Like a lot of things in this world, it relates to capitalism, right? And consumerism. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the 50s and how there was literally ads of people throwing plastic in the air. It'll make your wife's job easier because she has to spend less time cleaning up after everybody. What did that look like?
Yeah, right. So to be very clear, this is a consequence of capitalism, and within that, the fossil fuel capitalism. So, 99% of plastics are still made out of fossil fuels. It's a byproduct of pulling oil and gas out of the ground. You take energy to turn that into plastic. That comes with all sorts of these emissions to actually manufacture this stuff. But really, again, after World War II or during World War II, they were making more and more things out of plastic. So, that was due to shortages. So cotton shortages then turned nylon into a material for parachutes, for example. It was used to create synthetic rubber for tires because we were running out of rubber trees. So like piecemeal, it was replacing all these things during World War II, really took off in the 50s. As you mentioned, the kind of the beginnings of this throwaway culture, this consumerist mode of thinking, driven in large part by plastic, which, as you have mentioned, is this paradoxical material. It is extraordinarily useful, and I admit that in the book. Like this is a material that has had a lot of very important uses for medical devices and things like that. Planes would not be able to fly without plastics on the interior, making them lighter. But because it's made out of fossil fuels, because this material has been so cheap to produce, we have developed the mentality that we can use it once and throw it away. That is what the costs are on paper. When scientists talk about consequences, they refer to these as externalities. So that does not include the extraordinary cost to environmental and human health for plastics getting so out of control, escaping into the environment in just astonishing numbers. A growing body of evidence linking plastics to human health problems. There are at least 13,000 different chemicals that have been used in plastics, a quarter of which scientists consider to be of concern. None of these were tested on humans before they were put into production. We have this stupid way of operating in the American regulatory system of asking for forgiveness instead of for permission, for sending all these chemicals out there and poisoning not only humans, but the entire environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. I feel like a lot of chemicals are innocent until proven guilty when it should be the other way around. That pops up in a lot in the work that we do as an organization. I know you touched upon it a little bit, but you talk about plastics as being a fossil fuel. And when I first initially read that, I said, okay, I think of fossil fuel as nasty, dirty stuff, we pull out of the ground and it's oil and fossil fuels. Can you talk a little bit more about plastic as a fossil fuel?
Sure. So plastics at their core, literally at their core, they are built on a backbone of carbon, chains of carbon. This carbon is very readily and cheaply available from fossil fuels. So you'll hear sometimes about bio-based plastics. These are plastics that replace that carbon backbone with carbon pulled from plant, usually sugar, corn, those sorts of things. When a bio-based plastic, unfortunately, it is natural in that sense that it is carbon from plants, but it is filled with all these other petrochemicals that are derived from fossil fuels that make plastic a plastic. So you might hear sometimes that PVC, for example, is a particularly toxic plastic, and that is very true. A big bulk of its actual weight is made out of these additives. So a lot of them are called plasticizers. They are what give plastic the flexibility, keep it from becoming brittle, keep it from bleaching, these sorts of things. So plastics are not just made out of carbon from fossil fuels, they're made out of all these additional chemicals from fossil fuels. And just to reiterate the point that I made earlier, this is a massively carbon intensive process beyond pulling that carbon out of the ground. So you have to take energy to turn that plastic into plastic. And there is a growing body of evidence showing that once these plastics escape into the environment, they off-gas that carbon, largely methane, which is, of course, an extremely potent greenhouse gas. So think of plastics as fossil fuels. Think of plastics floating on the ocean as an oil spill by another name. It's essentially the same thing, and in a lot of ways, it's actually worse because plastics break down into microplastics and then can get into every single organism on this planet.
Sure, sure. Uh, you started to talk about it a little bit about chemical culprits conveyed in microplastics, whether it's endocrine disrupting chemicals like EDCs, POPs, PFAS, phthalates. I mean, the list goes on. And you said a little bit about how there's, tens of thousands of chemical additives, to make these plastics plastic, right? Uh, can you talk about chemical culprits a little bit?
Yeah, the crazy thing is in the book, I cite a study that said it was either 10,500 or 10,000 different chemicals that have been used in plastic, a quarter of which are considered to be of concern. Researchers get to that number only by reverse engineering plastics. We are not told what is in a plastic bottle or plastic bag. There's no ingredient list on it. So it's left to these chemists to reverse engineer these plastics. Um, that study that I cited in the book has been outdated now. About 6 months ago, a new study came out bumping that figure up to 13,000 different chemicals. There will probably be more. These companies have been using extraordinarily toxic chemicals in plastics that we know full well are bad for human health, yet they keep doing it. So BPA is the famous one that was actually phased out of plastics. But what companies are doing is something that scientists refer to as regrettable substitution. They are finding BPA, BPS, these sorts of alternatives that are almost exactly chemically similar. And they're substituting them in and saying, okay, we're BPA free. Don't worry about it. These substitutions are either just as toxic or oftentimes more toxic for human beings. So this is the regulatory anarchy that we find ourselves in the United States, is that we have more and more evidence that plastics are poisoning us and poisoning organisms in the environment. But we're like, nobody's required to tell us what they're putting in their plastics. It's an insane way of operating, especially now, as we talked about in the book, that there's this new dimension to plastics, which is the microplastics we are ingesting and inhaling that might even be coming through our skin through things like makeup. It's an added dimension that adds even more horror to the just already known list of chemicals in plastic.
Right. And I'm going to throw the link in the chat for everyone to see. If you want 30% off a poison like no other, head over to that website and grab it. It's a great read. You talk about in the book how, and I referenced at the beginning, Alaska is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the world. And the Arctic is in a unique position because of the constant feedback loop. Can you describe to the audience what that feedback loop looks like?
It's a nasty one, and it's one of the better known feedback loops in climate science. There are a lot of these unknowns that we're kind of staring at. Is permafrost also up north going to thaw and release a lot of methane? But this feedback loop in the Arctic is clear. It's an albedo thing. So albedo being the way that light either is absorbed into the landscape or bounces off. So when you have ice that is a white surface, it bounces a lot of the sun's energy back into space and actually keeps the landscape cool. As the Arctic is warming, we're losing that ice, and when that is gone, that exposes either dirt below, which is darkly colored, or deep ocean, which is also darkly colored. That absorbs more energy and leads to more melting of the ice. It's this vicious sort of feedback loop. It is important to also consider that microplastics are now, in a sense, part of that destruction of the Arctic. So scientists are finding more and more that these plastics are embedded in that sea ice. And there's concern that these darker colored plastics, like think of any plastic product you've ever seen, like multicolors, dark colored or light colored. The concern is that those dark colored microplastics are actually absorbing more sunlight into that ice and accelerating melting. And beyond those microplastics poisoning all the precious and very sensitive creatures in these northern ecosystems. It's a compounding issue that we have climate change already, but also these microplastics are adding on to the stresses that these species up there are having to endure.
Right, right. And in the book you talk about how it's a food web thing, right? So I mean, even the smallest of guys, ocean marine life ingested, and then it moves up the food chain. And who's at the top of the food chain? Us. So that's another thing that I have to consider, another piece of the puzzle. Vulnerable populations, specifically children and pregnant women, are very susceptible to passing on microplastics to their fetuses as well. Can you talk a little bit about that process and why younger populations are so much more vulnerable?
It's important to consider microplastics as not just micro, but on the nano scale. So, as scientists define them, microplastics are smaller than 5 millimeters, which is about the width of a pencil eraser. That is something you can very easily see with the naked eye. But these things get down into what are now called nanoplastics. Nanoplastics are usually defined as a millionth of a meter. So, these are particles of plastic that are not only small enough for us to easily inhale, but are small enough to get into individual cells in our body. And it's the studies haven't really come out on this yet about the human brain, but it's almost a certainty that these are small enough that are going to pass through the blood-brain barrier and get into our brain tissues. They're also small enough because they are finding these particles in placentas. They are finding, so that then means that mothers are passing these particles to their children before their children are even born. And that's honestly not surprising given the tiny, tiny nature of these particles. The issue there, of course, being that we don't want any of these particles in children, especially because their bodies are undergoing this extremely delicate balance of development. It's a sort of ballet of things kicking off in order for a healthy baby to develop. You had mentioned endocrine disrupting chemicals earlier. Those are the major concern here. There are a lot of those in plastic. Endocrine disrupting chemicals being ones that mess with our endocrine system and the way the hormones work and the way that these children are developing. So we know that they are our kids before they're even born. We know that they're in our lung tissue. We are inhaling lots of them. By one estimate, we're inhaling 7,000 particles a day. They are going through our digestive system. They are certainly small enough to get into our guts and pass through the gut barrier and get into other tissues. That has been shown in mouse models. So it's important to remember just how small these things get. It's not just microplastics though. It's nanoplastics, small enough to get into the individual cell, cause cell death in human cells that are cultured in the lab. Now it's just a really question of how much of this microplastic and nanoplastic is going to be too much to have in the body. None of it is going to be good. It's just going to be a matter of how much is going to be required for really detrimental effects.
Sure. In the book, you talk a little bit about how essentially two-thirds of our clothing is made out of plastic. I know that you talk about something called the pig pen effect, referencing a Peanuts comic. I'm wondering if you can describe what that is. And I mean, just this two-thirds of our clothes is plastic. I mean, what does that mean?
It's astonishing, and it's not something that even I, as a person who was writing about microplastics for years before doing the book, was fully aware of until I started writing the book and interviewing people who are working on this in particular. So, polyester, nylon, all these things are made out of plastic. It's counterintuitive. It doesn't make any sense. They're very soft plastic, but the stretchiness that you get in socks or underwear or that sort of thing, that is not cotton. That is fossil fuel plastic. So we have been for decades now wrapping ourselves in plastic, even though plastic is an extraordinarily toxic substance. So now, by one estimation, two-thirds of clothing is made out of polymers, these non-natural fibers. That is due in large part to the proliferation of fast fashion. Again, coming back to this insane consumerist mindset that we are okay wearing a piece of clothing, having it disintegrate, throwing it away, and then just going about our shopping to find a new one. Uh, it's not sustainable, and it's first of all just from like the resources going into actually producing those in the first place. But when we wash our clothing, by most estimates, most studies are finding perhaps several million of these fibers, these little microfibers, break off in a single load of laundry and flush to a wastewater treatment facility. That then flushes into the environment because these facilities are not meant to capture such tiny particles. That is actually a good chunk of the microplastics we are finding in the environment are from our clothing. So it's not just washing them either, it's this pig pen effect that you mentioned. So by another study, we just by walking around, moving around our homes, we shed something like 1 billion microfibers a year per person. And that falls to the floor. And then other studies are finding that in a typical living room per day, you might see several 100,000 of these microfibers accumulate per day. It's a pretty astonishing number, especially when you consider the kids are then crawling around on the floor. It's bad news all around. But this is the primary, extremely sneaky way that plastics infiltrated themselves into our daily lives without us realizing. We get it, like the bottles and bags, clearly plastic. But all along, we have been wrapping ourselves in plastics, especially given the proliferation of fast fashion.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really solid point with fast fashion. I mean, you have multi-billion-dollar companies like Zara, Shein, H&M, who are just cranking out, clothing, right? And then you also have the issue of, oh, well, that's an old piece of clothing that's outdated. You're gonna be considered lame if you're not wearing like the newest fashion. So it's like almost like a marketing stance too, right? Super savvy, almost like toxic salesman coming into these communities and saying, hey, this isn't good enough, which reminds me of Rachel Carson and how toxic salespeople would say, hey, this grass can be cut way faster if you just spray a bunch of DDT on it, right? So I do see parallels between what's been written in the past and what's being written now, which is a shame, but history does tend to repeat itself, so they say. I know we talked a little bit about capitalism and how it plays into our plastic fantasies. You talk about in the book uh, ocean cleanup, right? A plastic catcher in the Pacific Ocean, a 2,000 foot long plastic tube meant to clean up plastic from the ocean. I mean, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. What were they going for there?
You are not the only one with those feelings. When they launched it years ago, I interviewed a bunch of scientists, like ocean plastic experts. Hey, this is a good idea, and they said, under no circumstances is this a good idea. So the fallacy here is that we can clean up the problem once it's already out there. It's actually beach cleanups are pretty effective. Actually, so you just can't wait for that stuff to get all the way out to sea. So the first version of the plastic catcher they took out there snapped in half because it's the high seas. What the hell do you expect? It's itself made out of plastic and probably producing microplastics that are then falling into the water column. When scientists talk about real solutions to this crisis, they want us to go as far upstream as possible. As far downstream as you could possibly be is the plastic catcher. As far upstream as you can be is stopping producing this much plastic to begin with. So that is, you had mentioned the plastics treaty center negotiation. That is the ultimate like holy grail of that, the outcome of that. I don't know if it's going to happen, but if we get some sort of cap worldwide on plastic production, that's how you make a difference here. We cannot wait for the stuff to get out to sea to then clean it up. A little bit farther upstream, this is actually one that's quite effective. There are these barges, so they're all over the world now, but they started in Baltimore Harbor. One is called Mr. Trash Wheel. That's its real name. It has big googly eyes on it, and it has a boom that stretches out into the river, catches floating plastics before they get to the harbor and before they get out to sea. That's a much better way of going about this. We need these devices in every single river on the planet to make a difference here. Like waiting for it to get out to the high seas is absurd. They have to send a boat out, which churns through a bunch of fuel. It's like there's emissions involved. They got to bring that plastic back. It's on paper. It's well-meaning. I get that, but it's just not what plastic scientists want to see us focusing our time and money on.
Yeah. One thing that kind of struck me as interesting in your book is you say that at the core, the macroplastic crisis is the microplastic crisis. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, it's important to think of. really any macroplastic out there, a bottle or a bag, whatever you see floating around the ocean, that is pre-microplastic. Plastic by its nature is a very tough material, but it's not indestructible. In particular, one of the things that really breaks it down is UV bombardment. So the sun beating down on it, if it's floating out in the ocean, it just breaks into smaller and smaller pieces. Those get into smaller and smaller organisms. So the bottle that you see out there is not going to be a bottle forever. It's going to deconstruct into this galaxy of particles that then get into more and more places. Why I was saying that a bottle or a bag is really it's an oil spill by another name. It is breaking into not only particles that are themselves quite toxic, given the at least 13,000 different chemicals used to make plastic, any one of those could be toxic to an organism that ingests it, much less several of them probably compounding over time. But research is finding that as these microplastics break down and get into smaller and smaller bits, they gather up these. It's called a plastosphere. Sadly, it's a new ecosystem on Earth. It is algae and bacteria and viruses that gather around these particles and actually ride them around the oceans. When an organism eats that, they eat not only the chemicals in the plastic that leach out in their stomachs, but also take on those microbes, any number of which might be harmful to them as well. So, yes, a bottle is pre-microplastic. It's important to keep that in mind.
I know we've kind of been doom scrolling here this last 27 minutes. So I do want to give a chance to talk about some solutions. I know we touched upon it a little bit, and toward the end of the book, you describe solutions. I mean, is there a way out?
There are several ways out, and yes, that was a early on in the writing process. That was a note from my editor who said, "Could we, kick up the solutions a little bit here,
Yeah.
so we don't depress everybody." I don't know that might not have actually worked out because I still get depressed talking about it. Anyway, so yes, at the end of the day, the best shot that we have here, not to pin hope on politicians, unfortunately, but these negotiations for the treaty need to have a mandatory cap internationally on production. We cannot allow countries to set their own goals like the Paris Agreement did for climate change. Because if one company bans the production of plastic, a plastics company is just going to pick up and move somewhere else. It's just going to kick the can down the road or the plastic bottle down the road. So that is, at the end of the day, there's no substitute for that. But there are also ways to keep microplastics from escaping into the environment. You can buy for your washing machine this special filter that catches the microfibers, and then you just kind of dump them out. I have one at home actually where it's a special filter that you take out, replace every once in a while, send them back to the company, and the company turns it into insulation. So the idea is to lock that microplastic away as best as possible. But I just want to be very clear that the burden should not be on us as consumers.
Mm.
France has mandated that by 2025, all washing machines that come off the production line have to have these filters built in. You shouldn't have to go spend $50 on your own to buy an aftermarket filter. Governments should be sending these filters to their people, funded by taxes on these companies that make washing machines as a stopgap measure until we can get them all producing machines with these filters in them. And then there's also kind of solutions that I particularly like that solve a bunch of problems at once. So one that I talk about in the book is a rain garden. Rain garden being a very simple plot of greenery next to a road that catches stormwater. One of the big contributors to microplastics in the ocean is car tires. Car tires being made again out of synthetic rubber. There's a kind of plastic extraordinarily toxic that has been killing salmon in Washington State when they wash into those rivers. That is the one that we know about. It's probably much more common around the world than we think. These tire microplastics actually killing organisms. So a roadside garden beautifies the landscape. It mitigates flooding. It filters out these tire particles before they have a chance to wash out the sea. So it's like these small solutions are going to work. Filters on washing machines, roadside gardens. But at the end of the day, there's no substitute whatsoever for reducing the amount of plastic that is produced, not only the consumer products like bottles and bags and that sort of thing, single-use plastic especially, but also in our clothing. We could be making a lot more out of bamboo, cotton, that comes with its own emissions and water use and things like that. But that's much less toxic for the particles that escape in the environment.
Well said. And I know we talked about regardable solutions earlier in this call. You know, you have a bunch of unregulated chemicals, additives that are being substituted that we don't know much about. And it's like, why would we substitute it with something just as bad? Um, I also want to talk about just how busted recycling is, and if there's a way that we can, fix or mitigate the definition of recycling so it's not as counterintuitive.
Recycling is a tough one because you really want it to work, right? And that is in large part because the plastics industry tricked us into thinking that. So there's a story by NPR that came out a couple of years ago where they interviewed a former plastics executive who said, "Oh yeah, we knew all along that this was not economically feasible. If we could convince the public that they're recycling, that allows us to keep selling as much plastic as we want." They shunted the responsibility onto the consumer. And that is exactly what they're going to do going forward as we try to mitigate the plastics problem further. By first of all, fixing recycling, like there's only so much you can do. But they're going to try to do the same, blaming it on consumers when we start asking for mandatory caps on production. They are already saying, we produce this really useful material that you as consumers are demanding, right? Stop buying our products. If you, no, that's insane reasoning, and it's very transparent. No consumer is asking for everything that they buy to be wrapped in single-use plastic. It's just not okay. So recycling will play a role going forward, but the problem is that it has, in the United States at least, been a for-profit system. So because plastics is so cheap, it has always been much cheaper to just produce virgin plastics instead of going through the trouble of recycling it over and over. You can also only recycle an item a couple of times before it degrades too much, and you can't recycle it anymore. When you hear about plastics types talking about like a circular economy around plastic, that's nonsense. There's no such thing as a circular economy around plastic. That is not, first of all, a material that we want to keep in circulation. We do not want to surround ourselves with this stuff in perpetuity. But if it were the case that recycling worked and that like plastic circularity were possible, the plastics industry wouldn't have to keep producing exponentially more plastic year after year. So they're producing 1 trillion pounds of plastic a year right now. That is projected to triple by 2060. So, like, in what way is recycling working if that is the case? So, yes, I think there's going to be ways in like for certain plastics to be able to recycle as much as we can. But again, no substitute whatsoever for just not producing plastic in the first place. If we don't produce it, we don't have to recycle it.
It's kind of ironic because recycling itself is a form of greenwashing, right? Saying, oh, we're gonna, it has good intentions, but unfortunately, it's just going to contribute to the distribution of plastics, right? Which is awful, but still kind of funny. Another solution toward the end of the book too, you talk about is, well, prior to the last 100, 200 years, we got along just fine without plastic, right? What did that look like?
It looked a lot less toxic, right? So yeah, when you think about, God, I'm 39. I remember a time in my life where I just was not surrounded by anywhere near this amount of single-use plastic. It was not that long ago. It was also like in the grand scheme of human existence, it wasn't that long ago that we just didn't have plastic. It wasn't until World War II that the production really started getting out of hand. We got along fine with burlap bags and glass bottles and tin cans. They're like basically any sort of single-use plastic, you can substitute in a perfectly recyclable material like glass or aluminum. You can buy, like I have these cotton bags that I take to the grocery store and I put my produce in. Why did that have to be made out of plastic that they're giving us at the store? It is what the plastic industry has done really well at is convincing us, convincing is the wrong word, bamboozling us as a population to thinking that we need this material, and we do not. Plastics in medical devices, okay, fine, but then you also have to consider that these are made out of highly toxic chemicals. What chemicals are leaching into an IV bag, for instance, right? So we need to fundamentally renegotiate our relationship with plastic. That means switching to glass and aluminum wherever possible. Those come with their own emissions in producing them, obviously, but they're much more easily recyclable. When they escape into the environment, they do not break down into toxic particles. Glass essentially breaks down into sand. So, yeah, it's like we've been bamboozled into thinking we need this material. We do not. And if we keep up this relationship, if we let the industry get away with this, they're going to produce exponentially more of it, and it's going to drown the world further and further in this truly toxic material.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point that I think a lot of the time the pressure is put on the consumer, right? Oh, you need to do this better. You need to do XYZ better to reduce emissions in your own, footprint, which is fine, but I mean it's never gonna amount to industry, right? In just how skewed the numbers are when you look at who's contributing. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
and yeah,
like remember that
yeah,
BP invented the idea of a carbon footprint, right? Like that was a marketing ploy for them to shunt the responsibility onto the consumer. And keep in mind that the plastics industry and the oil industry are the same thing. These oil companies all have wings that produce plastic. They're doing the same thing with plastic, is making us feel bad as consumers of this material. Unwitting, oftentimes, consumers, if we're buying clothes that we don't know are made out of plastic, but it's our fault that this is so out of control, right? They're just fulfilling a market need, which is a truly absurd production of the capitalist mode of thinking. I get very frustrated by it because I don't want people to feel responsible for this problem.
yeah, that's a really solid point. And just, I mean, plastics are useful, especially toward the beginning of the book. You talk about their integral part in the healthcare system, right? As far as like being sterile. But I mean, does it really mean anything if those plastics are getting into your IV bag? I mean, that doesn't seem very safe. So that was a lot of content. I know we kind of just spearheaded that. I want to zoom out a little bit. How did you arrive at the title "A Poison Like No Other"?
That was that wasn't my original title. My original title was boring. It was something stupid like the microplastic pandemic. I think because I was writing it in a pandemic. And then the editor said, I don't think people want to hear about pandemics any more than we already have. That was a line that was originally in, I think it might have been the introduction, right? I called it "To Poison Like No Other" because uh, like on a couple of levels. So it is a poison that traditional toxicological sense that it's killing creatures and poisoning our bodies. But more in the metaphorical sense as well, that this nasty creeping influence over the whole planet. Just this widespread poison, and it's just so different from a typical poison in that it is a accumulation of at least 13,000 different chemicals in one little package. Not every single piece of plastic it has 13,000 ingredients, but have been used in the production of it. So it's like arsenic's a poison, right? But we much better understand that you are not supposed to have arsenic in your body. It's much harder to get control in microplastics.
Great, great. We do have several questions. We have about 20 minutes left in this webinar, so we can go ahead and start tackling those. Let's see what we got here. Robert asks, how do you define microplastic 00 under 5 millimeters? And how do you detect microplastics under 5 microns?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So microplastic, I think I had mentioned smaller, defined as smaller than 5 millimeters. It's weird. It was kind of an arbitrary decision on this part of the scientific community. They were just it was originally dreamed up because they were trying to differentiate between the macroplastic that like a turtle would choke on, like a bag. They were thinking, okay, well, what's small enough to get into individual creatures like plankton in the open ocean? And they landed on 5 millimeters. It was a little bit arbitrary, but that's what they landed on. So they're still debating where a microplastic turns into a nanoplastic, and that's typically around a millionth of a meter or a micron, as they mentioned there. So what you need to detect this, unfortunately, is very expensive, specialized equipment. So nanoplastic science is really just getting started because it is so difficult to detect something that is a millionth of a meter in diameter. So that science is starting, and the early stuff in the environment is absolutely bonkers. So there was one researcher went to I think it was in the Alps, just at a remote mountaintop, and just collected what fell out of the sky, and like billions of particles of nanoplastics are falling on a square foot of snow every week. It is like there's not just a lot of nanoplastic out there, it is a fundamental component of the atmosphere. The stuff is so small and so light that it is getting up there and blowing all around the world. As are microplastics, like the stuff that's a millimeter long, that can take to the air as well and actually get up way into the atmosphere. So yes, it's a good question about how scientists define these things. But it'll actually be very interesting in the coming years. I think a lot of the focus is going to shift away from microplastics and start talking a lot more about nanoplastics because that is much more abundant in the environment and much more problematic for human health because as I had mentioned, these are the ones that are small enough to get into the individual cells. So yeah, stay tuned for that fun research in the coming years.
Stay tuned. Logan has his hand raised here. I'm gonna check that out. Let me see here. I'm gonna let him talk. Logan, you are live. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Adam and Matt. Can hear me okay, I assume?
Yes,
Matt,
sir.
an attorney at Clean Air Council in Pennsylvania, and I wrote the plastic bag bill, and we do a lot of we've done some litigation in Pennsylvania on it as well. One thing that some of the groups are pushing for in the Pittsburgh region and in other parts of the state are the alternatives like bioplastics. We have, and I'm glad that you didn't mention it. I, for one, am very against it, and I've been pushing organizations not to fall into the trap of it for many, many reasons. I look at plastic as having two life cycles: pre-use and post-use, and I think bioplastics have as much damage post-use as regular plastic, fossil-based plastic, and there's a host of problems pre-use also. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also, please stay tuned. We will be having some pretty big news out of Pennsylvania, I think, in the next few months on this. So we're going to be making some moves. But thanks, Matt and Adam.
Great. Sure. Yeah. Love to hear it. Yeah. Do keep me posted. Yeah. So the bio-based plastics are problematic for something that I had mentioned earlier. First and foremost, is that the carbon is pulled out of plant material. Sounds all well and good. That is just one component of that plastic. You still need these really toxic plasticizers to turn it into a proper plastic that is water resistant, heat resistant, that sort of thing. We also have to consider when it comes to the carbon input into that plastic, you need a lot of water and a lot of land and a lot of fertilizers to grow that plant material. So you are not like you're not pulling oil or gas from the ground, which is all well and good. That is something that's awful and needs to stop immediately for a whole host of reasons. But you're kind of kicking the emissions elsewhere. There was one it was a couple of years ago. I mentioned the book. I might screw up the exact figures here, but there was a study that came out a couple of years ago that actually like added up. Okay, if you were to replace all the single-use plastic in Europe with bio-based plastic, you would need something like the size of France, like as far as the amount of land required to grow the requisite carbon to go into that bio-based plastic. And you would also need the amount of water that exceeds I think the annual withdrawal in the EU, which is that's a good amount of water. So this is a hugely important thing going forward. Is that just like we need to be very careful about the chemicals that we are substituting in, the so-called less toxic ones for things like BPA, that we don't want regrettable substitutions in that case. We do not want to be regrettably substituting materials we think to be better than plastic that turn out to be just as toxic. We need to get out of this mode of thinking that we were talking about earlier in the United States regulatory system, which is asking for forgiveness instead of for permission. We need much better testing on these materials before we go replace them widespread in the plastics industry. But also be wary of the plastics industry pitching their own bio-based plastics and saying that they're environmentally friendly. They are anything but.
Emily asks, curious, accumulating in wildlife, are there some organs that accumulate more micro nanoplastics than others? And any idea why that might be? Like organics accumulate in fat and milk. Does that happen with plastics?
That's a very good question. I haven't seen really a study that would look like compare different organs in within an organism. So typically you see a study that find like a some sort of species of plankton. We found it in its digestive system. Uh, where you're almost certainly going to see the most accumulation is in the digestive system, especially for ocean critters that are unwittingly eating these microplastics. There is some good research showing that that zooplankton, these little animals that are floating around in the open ocean, they mistake microplastics for actual food because they smell that plastosphere that we were talking about. They eat a particle thinking that it is like a piece of algae that they typically would be eating, and then that accumulates in their organs. I had mentioned earlier that there's good research showing that there's this sort of translocation, as scientists call it. These particles are small enough that they are moving through the digestive tract into other organs. It's really going to depend organism by organism on just the way they live. I don't think this has been really done in humans. We have found it in lung tissue, digestive systems, livers, all these sorts of things. I would expect the research to come out in the coming years showing that inhalation for us is probably the biggest mode of ingestion. So again, by one estimate, we're inhaling 7,000 particles a day. That is not even considering the stuff down on the nanoscale. This stuff is so readily taken to indoor air in particular. So it's a good question. I think that those studies will come out soon enough, kind of not only finding microplastics and nanoplastics in individual organs, as these studies have done in the past 10 years or so, but then comparing it. Okay, well, we found this much in a digestive system and this much in the liver, that sort of thing.
Alexandra asks, can you comment on the use of microplastics in fragrance, especially in fragrance encapsulation, such as used to scent laundry detergent?
So you might have heard about the microbead legislation that actually passed during the Obama administration. The public got up in arms thinking or realizing that all along the cosmetics industry has been adding these little microbeads to things like face washes, right? They're exfoliants to, which is so goddamn crazy to me. Like you can make them out of pits from fruits, right? Like that has been done for years, right? Because it is so cheap to make plastics, much cheaper than using pits from fruits. They thought, oh, we'll replace it with plastic. That will, of course, wash off your face and into the environment. The unfortunate problem with that legislation was that it was for wash off things only. It did not regulate things where microplastics are intentionally added otherwise. Cosmetics is actually the big one. So something like mascara has little microbeads, more often than not, inside of it that actually make it go on more smoothly. They act like little ball bearings. These intentionally added microplastics, as they're called, go way beyond the face washes. It was a good start that we had that legislation from years ago, about 10 years ago now. But we need much better. And this is actually a line in the draft treaty for the plastics treaty that came out a couple of weeks ago, actually has language in there about intentionally added microplastics, that we need to get a better handle on. Yes, these are the products that you're mentioning, because at the moment in the United States, it's only legislated that we consider wash off stuff, which is the tip of the iceberg.
Robert says there are not many toxicology, tests on nanoplastics. They are foreign and should not be good, but they are difficult to work with us as we cannot measure them easily and they cannot quantify their effects on cells. Please comment.
Yeah, yet another problem. Maybe not a problem, but a challenge to overcome in nanoplastics research is that scientists have just begun to actually quantify how much of it is in the environment. There hasn't really been good quantifications of how much is in indoor air in the home. For microplastics in general, there are a lot of those. But yeah, so you're getting at an interesting shift here in the science. So right when I was about finishing the book, there was kind of a shift in the science between, okay, we know where in the environment microplastics are, which is literally everywhere. We know what organisms it's in. We know how much of it's in the atmosphere, that sort of thing. Focus is now shifting to what you're talking about here, which is what are the effects then? And something I had mentioned earlier, which is okay, how much is going to be too much to have in the body, be that nanoplastics or microplastics? We need quantifications of how much is going to injure people. Because as a scientist that I talked to in the book mentions this, like we need to put interventions in place, especially for children. If it comes out that this stuff is actually contributing to asthma rates and lung cancer rates because we're inhaling so much of it, we need to figure out how much is causing a problem to be able to put in the preventative measures. So scientists talk about like to understand something and to fix something, to legislate it and like prevent microplastics from getting to the environment, you have to first fully understand how much of it is out there. You have to agree on definitions as to what it is. California's actually been struggling with this. Maybe not struggling is the right word, but they just got through a period of time where they had to define what a microplastic is. That allowed them to say, okay, this is much as going to the environment. Then you can compare the mitigation measures for like microfiber filters on washing machines and things like that to a baseline. So yes, good point that this nanoplastics are very hard to work with, but in the coming years we'll see, I think, a lot more research on this.
We do still have quite a few questions, so I just want to give everybody a heads up. We're probably not going to be able to get through all of these. I know that we've kind of just been bombarding Matt with questions here. Again, thank you for being on this call.
You can email me too. I'll just
Emily
say, yeah.
asks,
So you can find
yeah,
my email address, and if you have questions that don't come up, I can answer them.
absolutely. And if you can, if you're able to, just you drop your email in the chat if you're comfortable with
Yes.
that. I'm sure
Yeah.
people would love to chat with you. You know, obviously, I didn't want to just throw that out there, but I do
No, no, no.
appreciate.
No, I'm happy to. I love answering questions.
Cool, cool. We do got some
There you
more
go.
for you. Emily asks, plastic and microbes. Is there evidence that microbes are evolving to live on slash degrade slash use nanoplastics? Or in other words, surviving plastics where other more slowly evolving life may have not?
Cool question. And this comes back to the plastisphere that we were talking about earlier. I have a you can probably Google it and it'll come up. I usually have this in the presentation I do. There was a study that did a scanning electron microscope images of the plastisphere. These like super detailed, very, very tiny. They found these little spheres that were living in pits on a microplastic surface. I don't think at the time they identified the particular microbe, but they were speculating that that microbe was doing something to excrete maybe an enzyme or something that was breaking down that plastic. There have been some indications that there are microbes in general out there that are able to break down plastic. You will hear sometimes that there's like a lab has found a new enzyme or microbe that is able to break down plastic better and improve recycling. I find that very doubtful. We'll see. So are organisms going to evolve to tap into this is a great question. And you would expect probably, right? This is a good source of energy. Like it's basically pure carbon. Fortunately, it's pure carbon that's been sullied with all sorts of other plasticizer chemicals and that sort of thing. So an organism would have to get past that toxicity. What we cannot rely on whatsoever is like nobody's going to find a microbe that can digest plastic and then release it into the environment, right? So like that could be ecologically disastrous. So unfortunately, what's out there is already out there, but there are labs working on finding microbes that can digest plastics to do some sort of different recycling. But let's be careful that that doesn't give the industry an excuse to keep producing as much plastic as it wants.
What do you see as other key elements of strong international treaty on plastics in addition to capping production? Pam asks.
Yes. So microplastic scientists, plastic scientists in general, are begging these negotiators to consider chemicals. So plastic, like we've done a good job of covering this here, obviously, but people I don't think realize just how many chemicals have been put into plastics, and how many of them are so toxic. So I wrote a story when the treaty was first under negotiations about this for Wired, saying that the plastics are not just polymers. They're not just cohesive materials. They are this bevy of chemicals that actually leach out of those plastics as they break down. So what these negotiators are trying for is bans on certain chemicals, certain particularly toxic chemicals used in plastics, or whole groups of chemicals that we know all of them to be terrible. We should get them out of plastics immediately. But coming back to this regrettable substitution idea is that we need safe alternatives. Unfortunately, like the safest alternative is just moving away from plastic. It is more glass, cardboard, aluminum, these sorts of things. But yes, the chemicals are really like beyond second to a mandatory cap on production globally. Negotiators are going for chemicals. They've honed in on that as being extremely important.
Carla asks, have you had pushback from industry due to publishing your book?
I have not. No, I have not heard from them. I don't know why. I asked them to comment for the book. One of the groups did not respond. The other just said they'd ask questions and then never provided me answers. I I wrote a story a couple weeks ago about the plastics treaty. Reached out to them again. Haven't heard back. I don't think they like me, but they are hitherto ignoring me. And we'll see how that changes in the coming years as I keep being a bit of a pain in the butt.
Well, yeah, you got to keep being a pain in the butt, right? I mean, it reminds me of the story in the book how you had an oceanographer who brought out an industry guy outright and was like, hey, like this is what's happening. Of course, it wasn't called microplastics then because that wasn't a word until 2004, I believe. But the industry guy basically was like laughing in his face and belittling him and blowing raspberries. And I think that that's probably the industry standard, if you will, which is so
Yeah,
backwards.
yeah, but I think like a bit of hope here is I think the public opinion has shifted in recent years that we're understanding we've been bamboozled. We have been absolutely surrounded by this totally toxic material, and we want less of it. Like there was a poll a couple months ago, maybe a little bit longer, that found that like something like 80% of Americans understand this is an emergency and that we need to do something. This cuts across the bipartisan lines. Like this is widely accepted in the United States. Like basically nothing. Like what else do we agree upon? 80% of Americans that we like ice cream. Maybe 80% of Americans agree. We also agree that the plastics are really terrible. They're an emergency, and we need to do something serious about them. So I think that is one nugget of hope. I think going forward.
Sure. Matthew asks, what sort of timeline would you advocate for the global phase out of plastic production? And what timelines are being considered for this international plastics treaty?
Yeah. So the negotiations are expected to last through 2024. I Here's the thing: is that that's what's expected. So these negotiations could drag out for years. This has happened with previous treaties plenty of time. You can say it's going to be done by 2024. It may very well not be. There is a lot of pushback from countries like the United States that produce a lot of plastic. They want to keep doing that. Um, France is moving really quickly on the microfiber and the washing machines, again, mandating that by 2025. But the California just came out with their guidelines say they're doing the same thing, but they're giving it to like 2028 or 2029 to have it mandated on washing machines. That is not fast enough. We are in a full tilt emergency right now. I understand that it's bureaucratic and a legislative process, but whatever it ends up being in the treaty is not going to be fast enough. We needed to drastically cut production of plastic 20, 30 years ago. we've let it get out of control this long, and we're really running out of time to do something before the world just fully drowns in plastic.
Fully drowns in plastic. I mean, there you have it. I mean, that's pretty much what's happening, right? And I know you talk about in your book that even if we were to stop all plastic production now, the ramifications of all the plastic that's already out there is pretty staggering. We are at about an hour. We have 3 questions left. You want to fire through these bad boys? Is that cool?
Oh, I have time. Yeah, if you want, if
Let's do it.
everybody wants to stick around, yeah.
Sounds good. And I will say that I love the resources pouring in through the chat. I'm doing my best as far as copy and pasting them to make it available for everybody. Um, Anybody else that's tuning in as well. I do want to say that this has been a production of Che Alaska, Collaborative for Health and the Environment. It's a program of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. It's part of a broader coalition, Che Environmental Health News, of over 5,000 individuals internationally. Lots of good stuff. And following this webinar, we will make sure that everybody has access to this recording and all the resources that we presented here. Make sure that you look for the link posted above to Island Press, their books. You can check out islandpress.org/books/poison-no-other. Use code webinar for 30% off. It's a great read. Definitely recommend picking it up. All right, 3 more questions here. Anonymous says, what do you think it will take to ensure the global treaty that's now being negotiated creates the kind of changes we need to fundamentally renegotiate our relationship to plastic?
It's that mandatory cap. It's going to be such a challenge, though. And I want to be very clear that I'm hoping for it, as our scientists, as our anti-plastics pollution groups, is that like that's the only way out of this problem. But we're going to get stonewalling from, again, countries like the United States that keep producing as much plastic as they want. Like, just to return to it again, the fears that this goes the way of the Paris Agreement, and that countries were allowed to set their own emissions targets. If you don't meet those targets, it's not like you get sued or anything like that. It's like you get shamed on the international stage. And that's why we haven't made as much progress on climate change as we should have. We cannot let the plastics treaty go in that direction. We need international buy-in from all of these countries to collectively agree that this is bad, and this is getting exponentially worse year over year. And if we don't do this treaty, honestly, there's nothing left. I don't know what else would help if we're going to let countries decide that they don't want to keep producing as much plastic. Again, if one country does that, it just moves to a different country. It's a mess. But coming back to this little bits of hope, I feel like populations all over the world are fed up with this. Like developing countries that are now getting flooded with plastic because the industry sees that as a growth opportunity for their industry. They're drowning in this stuff. They're seeing the problem. 80% of Americans see the problem. I don't know what the other 20% are doing, but that's good, right? So there's movement here. The treaty is our best chance, and our politicians really cannot screw this up. But also keep in mind that industry lobbyists are in those rooms, so we'll see how that goes. I'm sorry, I'm being cynical. Just my MO.
Right. And that's, I think, another good point too, is the industry is going to have their own scientists that are doing the work too, which is so backwards, right? You're hiring people to basically spread this false knowledge, which works a lot of the time, right? It's awful.
Works with recycling. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. This might be more so just of a comment from Janice. California Bill AB 1628 has been sent to Governor Newsom after passing the state Senate. The filters it would require for washing machines are intended to capture microfibers, tiny bits of material that break off from clothing and textiles during a wash cycle.
Yep. That's the one that I mentioned by 2020, 2029. I might be mistaken that. I think I read that. But yes, it's don't get me wrong, it's a very good legislation, and typically what goes in California spreads elsewhere. So maybe other states start picking this up. We cannot produce one more washing machine without one of these filters. But we also need to consider how to dispose of those fibers, right? So if you take them out of your filter from your washing machine, throw it in the trash. That is not saying that those fibers are going to be properly disposed of. Like that could take to the air in the waste management process. So we need not only these mitigation measures like we have in that California bill with the washing machine filters, but we need ways to dispose of what is essentially a hazardous material. The infrastructure for that will grow in some way, but we need to pay attention to that side of things as well. It's not just about the devices themselves.
Yeah, and I know that you also wrote in your book that older washing machines had these filters, right? Which is kind of interesting. And also, the manufacturers of newer filters are saying, "Hey, send back in your old, or send back what's the filters are collecting, and we'll use it as insulation," which I think is another great way to mitigate some of the harm. One more question here. How is the fast fashion industry responding to non-plastic alternatives? Any ideas? I've seen awards for algae-based clothing materials, also synthetic biology, ellipsis. Any mention of this in the book?
Yes, in the book, I talked to a person who runs I forgot what it's called. It is a microfiber focused industry group. So they're working with a bunch of different brands on standards here. And that starts with research standards. So a lot of these companies, to their credit, are actually researching ways to produce clothing that doesn't shed as much microfiber. So they're not all the time moving away from plastic fabric, but they're figuring out ways to sew things better, to make the material itself less susceptible to shedding microfibers. I think it's very important to note that there are a bunch of studies that actually agree that the more you wash a garment, the fewer fibers it actually emits. That is because the first couple of washes, that's shaking loose all stuff left over from the manufacturing process. So what the fast fashion industry doesn't want you to know is that the best thing you can do is to buy high quality clothing and wear it for as long as possible. I operate on the assumption that even if I'm out of style right now, like in 10 years, maybe if I hold on to this, it'll come back around into style. It's like cyclical, right? So yes, they're working. I haven't heard much about alternatives, material wise, like algae and things like that. There might be room for that. Just not to harp on it, but to come back that we don't want some regrettable substitutions. We want this material to be safer than these plastics that we're currently wearing. More bamboo. Bamboo's great, grows like crazy. It's more sustainable in a lot of ways than cotton. But yeah, but just at the end of the day, moving away from that whole fast fashion mentality, which is truly destructive.
Absolutely. Well, that's all it from the audience questions. I do just have one question for you. Now that you've published this beautiful book that I can't put down, what's next? I mean, what do you see yourself kind of writing about in relation to plastics in the future?
Hopefully not much. No, I'll cover it day to day for Wired. I'm focusing on my garden, things that give me joy. But I don't know. Maybe there's a follow-up book. I maybe do like to do another edition because the science is moving so quickly. I mean, there have been studies coming out that was like came out months after we published that I wasn't able to include. It's the field is going crazy right now in a good way. So we'll see much better science coming out in the coming years. I, for one, will cover the plastics treaty for day-to-day news coverage. But for books, I need a breather, especially after this one. It took a lot out of me.
For sure. Well, again, thank you so much, Matt, for coming on and talking to me about this amazing book. Really appreciate having you here. And yeah, I think that's going to do it for us. Thank you for
All
coming
right.
on, Matt.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, and again, we'll make sure that we have this webinar sent to your inbox. If you are here presently, we'll make sure that we have a recording on our website as well. And that's where we're going to leave it off today. We hope to see you again here next month, and take care, everybody. Bye, Matt.
Bye.